Matter is governed by the fixed laws of physics and chemistry. For example, we can understand the shape and motion of a heavenly body, such as a star, with the law of gravity. But what about life, living beings and organisms? Life and living beings are also governed by fixed laws. At the same time, the extraordinary diversity of shapes and their unpredictable development questions us and pushes us to understand the relationship between the creative complexity of life on the one hand and the fine simplicity of its fixed laws on the other. This is the creativity of life, between simplicity and complexity. DNA contains the necessary genetic information for the development and smooth functioning of most living organisms. As you can see in the image, DNA consists of combinations of 4 nitrogenous bases, adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine, which are common to all living systems. The genetic makeup of every living being, the genome, is mostly shared among very different species. Every human being shares 99.9% of their coding DNA with every other man. For instance, we share a good 98.5% with chimps and even 97.5% with mice. The extraordinary thing we now know, thanks to Crick and Watson's discovery of DNA and the decoding of the human and other genomes, is that all life, everything, all the 3 million species of life and plant life, all have the same source. This genetic universality coexists with a huge biodiversity. According to very recent studies, for example, the smallest forms of life that have been found are known as nanobes. These plants are extremely small in size. They are nothing but filamentous structures of 20 billionths of a meter in diameter. Therefore, they are even smaller than bacteria, which, so far, had been considered the smallest form of life. But in the oceans of our planet, not far away from where the nanobes live and have been discovered, you can find the world's largest cetaceans, the famous blue whales. They can be up to 30 meters long. That is 1.5 billion times larger than the tiny nanobes. Let's listen to how Charles Darwin, in the last pages of his most famous book on the origin of species, described this huge biodiversity, this incredible variety of forms, which is a distinguishing feature of life and its creativity. It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and dependent on each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. These laws, taken in the largest sense, being growth with reproduction, inheritance, which is almost implied by reproduction, variability from the indirect and direct action of the external conditions of life, and from use and disuse, a ratio of increase so high as to lead to a struggle for life, and as a consequence to natural selection, entailing divergence of character and the extinction of less improved forms. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely, the production of the higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that was this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been, and are being, evolved. This diversity among living creatures is amazing and might suggest that differences are so huge that it is impossible to find regular patterns in such vast biodiversity. But let's look carefully at these images and let's try to understand what all the species have in common. Though very different, all the species have eyes, or rather, they all have 2 eyes. As a matter of fact, there are solutions which nature has repeatedly used. This is called convergent evolution, which creates similar structures with similar shapes and functions in species with independent evolutionary histories. Another question might be, in addition to the characteristics we have just described, is there some common feature that cannot be readily perceived by our eyes but can be discovered if we look beneath the surface? Well, there is, indeed. There is a more structural feature which is more universal than those just mentioned, and that is common to all living organisms, that is the urge to survive. In order to live, it is necessary to survive, that is, to stay alive as long as possible, to escape death as long as possible, and to preserve oneself in a certain environment in relation to other living beings or animate beings. This feature is common to the predator, the lion, and the prey, the gazelle, and to a seemingly insignificant plant which grows, manages to survive, and even to reproduce under the most hostile conditions. Let's make an example to understand what the urge to survive is and how it is achieved. Let's imagine, for instance, that there is a boat in the middle of the sea, and on this boat there is only one person on board. This boat is now very far away from the mainland and the port. At some point, due to bad weather, a storm, for example, or an accidental collision with an object floating at sea, this boat gets damaged. In theory, the optimal solution would be to go back to the port and have the boat repaired. But, as I said, the boat is now too far from the port. So, if it tried to go back, it would probably sink. Therefore, the optimal solution is not feasible. However, this is not the end. All is not lost. The person on board may be able to repair the damage in a makeshift way, survive, and keep afloat in the middle of the sea. Why have I made this example? Because this example makes it clear that in order to survive, an individual or a species does not necessarily need to find the optimal solution to a problem. It is sufficient that the solution works, that the solution is efficient. To understand how this urge to survive is achieved in nature through non-optimal but efficient solutions, let's take a second example. And this time, it is going to be a real example. An example taken from the life of emperor penguins in Antarctica. This species, the emperor penguins, isolate themselves by making a long march to a specific zone of the South Pole to reproduce, as far as possible from hungry predators that are ready to eat their laid eggs or chicks in the first months of their life. In this case, the isolation of an entire population is the most efficient or effective survival strategy found by penguins to make up for the vulnerability and inefficiency of their reproduction processes. It is not the optimal solution, that is the most efficient solution. It is efficient, effective, and good enough to ensure the survival of a population of the species, so much so that the emperor penguins are still making this march to reproduce. The last topic we want to mention to better understand the implications of the urge to survive is energy consumption. Survival is always the result of different factors, or, in other words, it is a multifactorial phenomenon. But one of the most important factors is definitely energy consumption, with all that this entails. To survive, it is not enough to efficiently find and assimilate energy from the environment. It is also necessary to consume energy in an efficient way. This is exactly the problem solved by every species through metabolism. To understand the relevance of this problem for survival, just think that every organism, even the smallest, the most seemingly insignificant, the simplest, the most elementary organism, as a single cell, is an extremely complex system made up of different parts or regions. And their energy must be distributed to all its parts efficiently. Therefore, the problem of energy consumption inevitably requires solving the problem of energy transport and of energy distribution to all the parts of that organism To better understand how life has dealt with this issue, let's make a comparison with the way man. Technology and engineering have tackled and solved similar problems on energy transport. In a city, it is necessary to build the most suitable infrastructures for an efficient transport of energy, goods, and fundamental resources, not only energy but also water and gas. Energy must reach all the areas and buildings where resources are used. Nature has also found amazing and diversified solutions to the problem of transport. In particular, as we have already seen, living beings must provide energy to every part of their organism to survive, and it is therefore essential to have an efficient transport system to ensure the smooth functioning of the organism. As we have just seen, life has managed to find a very wide range of solutions to the problem of energy transport. And this is better understood by comparing any organism of the vegetable kingdom, such as a tree or a flower, with an animal. From a morphological standpoint, in other words, in terms of shape, organisms' constitution and energy transport system, animals and plants are very different from each other. Most animals, including ourselves, have a cardiovascular system consisting of a propulsive organ, that is the heart, and the heart pumps blood through blood vessels, enabling the blood to reach the different body regions and to distribute oxygen and nutrients as efficiently as possible. On the other hand, plants mostly have vascular tissue arranged in distinct strands or bundles, also known as vascular bundles, which conduct the lymph, this time the lymph, not the blood, and its nutrients to the different parts of the organism. But this is not the only difference between plants and animals. Beyond the shape, there is something else that makes them clearly different. What makes them different is the mass, that is the way matter is organized and distributed. The mass of most animals, almost all of them, is well distributed, that is homogeneously distributed throughout the body. On the contrary, the geometry of plants is quite heterogeneous, as can easily be seen. The mass of plants is mostly distributed in some parts, for instance in the trunk or in the branches, and less in others, such as the leaves, the flowers, or the petals. Now, that the remarkable diversity between plants and animals exists is clear, but another question would be, besides this diversity, besides mass and shape diversity, is there a common feature to all living systems? Biology and physics together have provided a positive answer to this question since the 1930s by formulating the so-called Kleiber's law that was named after Max Kleiber, the Swiss biologist who first discovered it. This common feature is not only energy consumption, but it also concerns the efficiency of energy consumption and transport. In other words, energy consumption patterns in all living creatures, with no exception, are described by a law, Kleiber's law, which establishes a universal mathematical relationship between the organism's mass and its metabolic rate. Let's try to understand what this is all about. Well, let's focus on the key topic of our exhibition. But first of all, let's see Kleiber's law. In this graph, you can see the relationship between the basal metabolic rate, denoted by B on the y-axis, and the mass, measured in grams on the x-axis. Each dot corresponds to the measurement of a species individual, therefore its mass and energy consumption, while the different colors represent different species. All the different species, plants, birds, fish, are arranged along this line. Despite small fluctuations or deviations from the line, on average, these dots are arranged quite regularly. This regularity is explained by Kleiber's law and applies to many orders of magnitude, from the smallest plants to huge cetaceans. The relationship between mass and metabolism is well described by a mathematical function known as power law. That is, B is proportional to mass to 3/4. This applies regardless of the environment or morphological conformation of the mass in individual organisms. Other laws, called scaling laws, also depend on this relationship. They link, for example, the average lifespan of a species to its mass. How is it possible to understand the origin of this mathematical relationship, which is empirically observed between metabolism B and mass M, that applies to so many different species? Well, to try and explain this, let's make an experiment. The metabolic rate measures energy consumption and, as we have already seen, it also depends on the efficiency of energy transport and distribution from one region of the organism to its different parts. As a matter of fact, and this is exactly the aim of the experiment, we want to show you that this relationship is universal because it is linked to the efficiency of the solutions found by nature for an optimal energy distribution to all parts of an organism. But now, let's see the experiment. Let's imagine we are in the freezing cold of Siberia. There is a town with 9 houses arranged on 3 sides of an imaginary square. Given the low temperatures of the region, each house needs to be provided with a constant amount of energy in the form of gas at every hour of the day to guarantee constant heating. Since there are 9 houses, there need to be 9 gas lines that come into the first of the houses. We need to identify the best way to use the pipes at our disposal to meet the energy demand of each house at every hour of the day. We could think to arrange the pipes in a spiral, with 9 pipes in the first house, 8 in the second, and so on, creating a spiral-shaped structure that provides energy to all the houses. Let's bear in mind that each pipe can carry only 1 liter of gas. Therefore, one of the 9 liters that enter the first house will be used in that house, so only 8 liters will enter the second house, and 7 liters will enter the third house, and so on, down to the last pipe that will carry the last liter of gas to the house in the center. Exact calculations will show that this solution needs 45 pipes. However, this is not the best option. There is another solution similar to the amazing branching patterns already shown, adopted by various organisms in nature, such as the vein patterns of leaves. The parallel is now clear to us. The city represents the organism, and each house is a cell thereof. The gas circulating in the pipes is blood. Since the blood volume in an organism is clearly related to its mass, there is a relationship between the energy consumed by the organism that is the gas used by the houses in our example, and the mass of the organism itself. Let me show you what we mean by branching pattern. Once again, there are 9 pipes entering the first house, but then they are arranged in a completely different way. And as you can see, here we have used far fewer pipes. Many of them are still in the box. Why is it so? Well, we used fewer pipes because we managed to meet the energy demand of the town in a more rational way. There are 6 pipes running on this side, plus the first 9 pipes, which sum up to 15. 16 plus these 4, that's 20, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, and 27. That is to say, 27 pipes instead of 45. Let's reflect on the numbers. We are on 2 dimensions. Therefore, in the formulae, the dimension d is 2. We thus have 3 squared, that is 9 houses. With 3 dimensions, we would have 3 cubed, that is 27. If each house needs a liter of gas per hour, the hourly demand of gas is 9 liters. We use 27 pipes, each of which carries 1 liter of gas. Therefore, in our parallel, there would be 27 liters of blood circulating at any given moment. It is now clear that there is a relationship between the metabolism and the mass of the organism, or the energy consumption and the liters of gas carried by the pipes. In 2 dimensions, the formula would be B equal m squared 2/3. If we move it to 3 dimensions, as it is the case for the organisms that inhabit our planet, we have the law of Kleiber. That is, B equal m squared 3/4. That is the optimum solution found spontaneously by nature in most cases, which makes it possible to relate greatly different organisms. As Samir and Francesca have just shown, the law of Kleiber expresses an optimum mathematical relationship in itself that does not depend on the shape, the mass, the energy distribution system of single organisms or living species. We could wonder why in nature there is such universal regularity as that expressed by Kleiber's law. To answer this question, it is not enough to refer to the survival drive that we have mentioned before. In order to answer this question, we need to bring up another factor that has been implicit up to now. This factor is the environmental pressure. That is the fact that survival takes always place in a certain environment. In fact, no living being can exist in isolation from that which is other than itself. That is, its environment and their relationship to other living beings. This necessary dependence of every living being on that which is other than itself has 2 aspects, 2 sides of the same coin. On the one hand, there is the pressure of the environment on the organism, which in the jargon of evolution theory we call selective pressure, which expresses itself, for instance, through the competition between living beings. This pressure boosts the efficiency of energy consumption and causes some forms of life of certain species to thrive and other to be dramatically reduced or even disappear. This is the law of selection. On the other hand, and this is the other side of the coin, the relationship to that which is other and to the environment does not cause only a selective or better a negative destructive pressure, but it is also a factor that makes life and survival possible. Just consider the sunlight plants need to receive from outside in order to perform the chlorophyll photosynthesis. Or simply, let's consider the nutritional substances that each organism needs to receive and assimilate. As we shall see shortly, there is a further element provided by the surrounding environment to enable life and survival: the cooperation between living beings, not only those belonging to the same species, but also between different species. Let's look into this aspect. An important and well-known example of cooperation between different species is that of plants and pollinators. This cooperation is essential for man, since 70% of our food exists only thanks to pollination, and man could not artificially replicate a pollination system as effective as that provided by bees and other pollinators. As we saw, each species is related to other species, and no species is an island. Therefore, in order to understand biodiversity, we need to study it in the whole ecosystem. We saw the incredible diversity of the living beings that inhabit the earth, and at the same time we saw that from this complex variety properties can emerge that are common to all living beings, from bacteria to whales. And we have explained the law of Kleiber. Now, we should try to consider not so much the single organism, but rather whole ecological communities in which different species interact, like in the mutualistic ecosystems I introduced. The question is, are there simple emerging properties at the level of ecosystems? Research in this field is still open and still evolving. But we do have empirical data and measures that could indicate that the answer to this question is yes. As you can see in the picture, the interaction between plants and flowers can be shown as a graph or a network of interactions with different species of pollinators that can interact with different species of plants and flowers. And these data that you can see in the picture on interactions between pollinators and plants have been gathered on different occasions over the last 50 years. Therefore, we can count on many data. We can illustrate these interactions through a table called matrix. And as you can see, the table is made of entries that can be either white, blank, or black filled in. As you can see in the picture, the filled-in entry indicates that a species of a certain column and the species representing another column or row are interacting. The entry is blank if there is no interaction. Therefore, we can have an overview of the interaction between plants and pollinators by observing the distribution of the black boxes in the table. And let's have a look at these two different ecosystems. One is an ecosystem in Puerto Rico, representing birds and fruit blossoms. The other is a Chilean ecosystem, representing plants and pollinators. And as you see in both tables, interactions are distributed in a way that forms a triangle, which is called nested structure in the specific jargon. In correspondence of these two ecosystems, you can see in red the same number of interactions between plants and pollinators, but randomly distributed. Let's try to understand the theory, since this is still a scientific theory that explains the self-organizations in different types of mutualistic ecosystems, that are ecosystems characterized by the beneficial interaction between plants and pollinators, also in different types of environment and in different types of ecosystems. But how can we explain a common origin leading to the emerging of these nested architecture within ecosystems? Also, in this case, the answer is based on an optimal principle. What do we mean by optimal strategy? The search for the plant or the flower that can lead to the maximum growth. We can draw an analogy even though it is not very precise. It is like when we choose a restaurant for dinner. We will pick the one that will give us the maximum satisfaction. In biological terms, this satisfaction is related to the chances of reproducing and to the effective evolution of the species, or rather with its adaptability. The final indicator of the optimality of an interaction between species is the growth of its population. This video aims at showing what happens if each species involved in the interactions within the ecosystems looks for its partner following the principle of maximum satisfaction, that is, the maximum growth of the population. As you see, on the right, there is a graph with a red line representing the total population of the species. Whereas, on the left, there is a representation of how the species interact, organizing themselves in order to optimize the growth of the population. So again, on the right, there is a red line representing the total population, and on the left, you see how the species interact, trying to optimize the growth of the population. Introducing the principle of optimization of the population, the species, represented by the entries in the table, create this triangular structure that is called the nested structure. So we have come to the end of our journey between simplicity and complexity of life. Now you will listen to an abstract from a conference by one of the most famous biologists of our time, Richard Dawkins, author of the bestseller, The Selfish Gene.
It is a truly astonishing thing. When I was young, I used to go to church, and we had a hymn that went, "It is a thing most wonderful, almost too wonderful to be." After that, it rather went off the rails. But when you look at a picture like that, which is just a small fragment of the universe, and you reflect that possibly on only one, but certainly on one of the stars in the universe, there is a planet in which the laws of physics have been transmuted through a very strange process to give rise to objects of quite staggering complexity and beauty, to give rise to us and our brains, which eventually proved capable of coming close to understanding the entire process that gave rise to us. And that process, which was discovered by Charles Darwin, had the effect of taking the ordinary laws of physics, which are extremely simple, and causing them to give rise to objects of ever-increasing complexity until finally, as I say, they turned upon the universe and understood it, or came close to understanding it.
As you see, Dawkins cannot stop the feeling of wonder in front of the whole cosmos, and particularly in front of the rise of something as complex as life, and then conscious life that can understand at least partially the very origin of its complexity. We would like to offer you a final thought. If we rewind the film of the cosmic evolution of non-living beings, stars, planets, and so on and so forth, we would probably get a path that is very familiar. The very same path that, if not identical, is the very same followed by our universe from the Big Bang until now. For instance, the life cycle of a star is conforming to the laws of physics of the universe, which generates its motion, its relationship to other heavenly bodies, the way it consumes energy according to its mass and its shape. Therefore, in this hypothetical new universe, we would not expect a triangular star zipping around among other stars. This would not be conforming to the laws of physics. What if we rewind the film to the evolution of living beings? Probably our path won't be identical to that of life on Earth. The different eras of life on our planet corroborate this hypothesis. Even in similar environmental situations or within the same environment, life has devised very different ways and very different manners to realize the fundamental instance, survival. Therefore, we could state that survival is the fixed instance, but life has realized this instance each time in many different ways, showing its big creative freedom. This example visually shows the difference between a type of evolution fundamentally based on necessary laws, like that of a star, and another type of evolution that is a result of the synergy between necessary laws and life's creative freedom. Therefore, in a determinist kind of process, not only are fundamental instances in the form of laws fixed and unchanging, but the way in which these instances are achieved is clearly defined. On the contrary, in a non-determinist process like that of the evolution of life, there are some unchanging instances, like survival or like the law of Kleiber. But the way in which they are realized is not fixed and leaves room for life's creative freedom. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved.